conference. I'm a panelist. For people in the world, but it's declining. When it comes to nutrition, Africa is still suffering.
Dear colleagues, a very good morning. Let's start in a few seconds. Good morning again. It's really good to see everyone. Perhaps some are better than others today. Those of you who were able to participate in the wonderful conference dinner yesterday evening next to the beach, we do trust that you've thoroughly enjoyed it. And there's a calmness one sees that is now with everyone on this last day of the conference. There will be closing remarks, of course, this afternoon. But we think that it's been a very robust and interesting conference with the types of discussions and at the level that one wants it. But thank you very much for joining us this morning for a very interesting panel. This will be the first time in this series of the Global Food Security Conferences that what we call for this conference a global trend commentary will be provided. There are many like conferences during a year on this broad notion of food security. So all the aspects are usually discussed based both from a scientific disciplinary basis, but especially from a policy future forward type of perspective. And the intention of this Global Trends commentary is to have experts who have participated or are leading major streams globally to come and share their insights, but also share with us, very importantly, what the findings from those engagements are and how that will integrate for very robust and forward-looking discussions going forward. This is important, colleagues, because it not only considers the discussions over the past 2 days, but as have been mentioned, pull together other global events in this broad notion of food and nutrition security and to provide us, to assist us to understand what the strategic trends and the intentions of those are. We have an illustrious panel, 3 here physically and 1 who will join virtually, and please allow me to introduce them briefly. Professor Cheryl Hendricks, in the middle, is a member of the Malabo Montpellier panel, and she will also report on that panel and forum, and is the director of the Institute for Food, Nutrition and Wellbeing at the University of Pretoria. I'll be very happy that you're joining us, Cheryl. Thank you. Dr. Patrick Caron, on your left, will speak on the review of SDG 2 of the United Nations High-Level Political Forum that took place in July, and the identification of critical and emerging issues by the high-level panel of experts of the United Nations, which he chairs and has just been reappointed as the chairperson. He's from France, and inter alia, the former general director of CIRAD. Patrick, good morning. The person who will join us virtually is Professor Mandy Rukuni, a well-known person on the continent and abroad. He is inter alia the architect of the Science Agenda for African Agriculture, S3A, a former Dean of Agriculture at the University of Zimbabwe, and a former director of the Kellogg Foundation in Southern Africa. He is established and now heads the Beat Doctoral Academy, which is located in Zimbabwe. And then Professor John Kennelly, he's from the University of Alberta, Dean of Agriculture. He is also the president of GCHERA, which is the Global Confederation of Higher Education Associations for Agriculture and Life Sciences, a member organization representing over 900 organizations and institutions in the world, very well established, and also heads the World Agriculture Prize. I've had the pleasure of joining him for that event in China just a month ago. John, thank you very much also for being here. Colleagues, we look forward to these types of discussions because the strategic trends, insights, and directions will not only be important for the next conference, but add value to the type of discussions that we've had over the past 2 days to really have this collective approach, if I may, for us to go forward. So let us start, please, with Professor Cheryl Hendricks, who will speak on the Malabo Montpellier panel and the forum. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you, Aldo, and thank you to the organizing committee for the opportunity to share with you some of the lessons learned from work that we've been doing over the last 18 months with the Malabo Montpellier panel. The panel is an evidence-based dialogue in order to inform policy making, particularly related to Africa. The panel was formerly called the Montpellier panel, which discussed issues related to Africa, but in its new iteration, it is called the Malabo Montpellier panel, and it is accompanied by a forum that I will explain just now, and how this will work together with this group of scientists. So the panel consists of 17 international experts, 5 from Europe and 12 of us from Africa. It's led by Dr. Usman Badiani and Professor Joachim van Bron, who together provide the strategic guidance with people from 16 different countries. The panel is accompanied by a forum, which is a high-level platform for dialogue and engagement with high-level state actors. So the 2 champions are the Right Honourable Saulus Chilima, who's the Vice President of Malawi, and His Excellency Abdoulaye Baye Touche, who's from the Republic of Benin. And so this forum will take place for the first time next week in Cotonou, where 10 leaders of the equivalent of the vice presidents and the ministers of state will gather to discuss the first report that we produced. So each year, a report is produced by the panel, which focuses on a specific topic. This year's topic focused on malnutrition and is entitled How Africa Can Build a Future Free from Hunger and Malnutrition. The report draws on the African context in particular, and so moving from the Millennium Development Goal era into the CAADP Maputo Declaration, which was from 2003, into the Sustainable Development Goals, in which the African governments had quite rich engagement about how the Sustainable Development Goals would relate to African development. And this is reflected in the African Union Agenda 2063 and then reiterated in the Malabo Declaration, hence the name of the panel. So the Malabo Declaration is significant because it focuses on how agricultural-led growth and transformation can lead to shared prosperity and improved livelihoods. So of course, food security and nutrition form part of that agenda. This is also reflected in the African Regional Nutrition Strategy and the CAADP Results Framework, which in January next year will be presented by the heads of state at the African Union Heads of State meeting, which becomes a very sharp tool for accountability in terms of African governments. So governments are in search of what can be done in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals along with the African Union's goals and these CAADP goals simultaneously. So governments are having to work in much smarter ways to simultaneously achieve a number of goals on different components related to development. And the panel seeks to try and provide some guidance on that. So recognizing that the choices made both at the household, the micro level, as well as the macro level, affect the outcomes for nutrition, we worked on 2 components. So understanding that undernutrition and malnutrition in general impairs productivity and is an impediment to national growth. And this is something that African governments are taking on wholeheartedly and trying to seek solutions to find ways to overcome this and to harness the potential of nutrition integrated into food security and development plans to provide better opportunities, particularly for children in future. So the panel recognizes, and this is significant in the African context, that we're not talking just about undernutrition, but we're talking about malnutrition in all of its forms. So looking at underweight as well as micronutrient deficiencies and overweight. And this is significant in the African agenda because formerly programs based on nutrition looked only at undernutrition. But we are making sure the governments start to realize that a wave of change is happening, and if they don't get on board with policy reform quickly, they are not going to be able to deal with malnutrition in all its forms, which is required both in the African agenda goals as well as in the SDGs. So looking across a number of countries, we identified that there were a number of programs that were being implemented by African governments, and some of them have very innovative components. The top performers that we found across different countries in Africa were increased focus on breastfeeding, biofortification, homestead gardens, but not just homestead gardens in that you promote homestead gardens, but some very interesting models around how community mobilization and ownership of programs starts to happen. One of the areas that emerged as very important was better data for effective interventions, and how again we can harness technology, for example, to generate far more up-to-date and current data in order to understand trends and changes. The major components that prevent progress on nutrition, of course, relate to climate change, and one of the peculiar components to Africa is conflict resolution and conflict situations, which provides additional challenges and disruptions to both the food production as well as the food supply components. So we identified from this search across African countries, 7 countries that have really done well in reducing undernutrition in particular. And so these countries were dealt with more in detail to understand exactly what had they done to make significant changes between 40 and 56% reductions on the Global Hunger Index over a period of 15 years. And what emerged from this is that there are 3 major themes: institutional changes related to policy, as well as to the structure of government and the organization, particularly of multi-sectoral platforms for managing food security and nutrition. The programmatic components were fairly similar across the countries, but the 7 stand out because of specific peculiarities that they have implemented, particularly around multi-sectoral coordination and high-level coordination, so taking it beyond the level of ministries into the President's or the Prime Minister's office. And then very innovative ways around inclusion in the implementation of these programs, because that's usually the fault. We have great policies, but the implementation we never get round to. And so multi-stakeholder platforms for the implementation emerge as some of the key successes in these 7 countries. And so the key elements that were identified as the successes amongst these countries were adopting a comprehensive policy for food security and nutrition. Sometimes they are simply multi-sectoral nutrition programs, sometimes they are integrated food security programs, and sometimes they are agriculture, nutrition, and food security integrated into the global development goals of the country. And so in every country, we see that in these 7 countries, we see that this was a significant turning point for the government in these 15 years, was making this concerted effort. But not only doing that, also implementing the institutional arrangements to manage the progress on that. I've mentioned the broad partnerships that were dedicated to nutrition, not only intersectoral, so health, agriculture, welfare, public works, infrastructure working together, but also coordinating the NGO sectors as well as the donor organizations in country. So no longer permitting donor agencies to go in and implement ad hoc programs, but strongly coordinating that either through agriculture sector working groups or multi-sectoral groups that integrate agriculture and nutrition. So mechanisms to manage this coherent policy comes out as a very strong theme in these countries. And this is particularly important, not just at the general state level, but all the way down through government, right the way to community level, with community level platforms being arranged to manage these various programs and to create the accountability between national or local government as well with the community. Investing in crisis prevention and emergency intervention are the two hallmarks that get two unusual countries on the list of 7, Angola and Cameroon, which you wouldn't expect to see on this because the rates of malnutrition are significant. So given that they started with a very high rate of undernutrition, their progress is remarkable. And especially given that it's ongoing crises, it's not over, they still deal with a significant problem, especially around acute child undernutrition. But they invested very strategically in managing conflict and managing undernutrition. So with identifying children who needed assistance fast and referring them into healthcare systems rather than just leaving it up to the system to find them. So deliberate efforts to address these components. Protecting people when we have a crisis is another hallmark of these 7 countries. Not all of them did so, but particularly those who are in crisis, of deliberately identifying the most vulnerable people and providing a lifeline to them when needed. So rapid response to emergencies and having the contingency plans to be able to do so is very important. Strengthening food system regulation and controls is something that many of these countries did as well. Some quite interesting innovations around the control of advertising of certain foods to children, being quite active in terms of legislation around fortification standards, for example, about the management of fortification and making sure that government delivers on its promises at all levels in the food system. And quite a strong focus on improving the quality of diets. So not just focusing on staple foods, but in each of these countries that diversified beyond staple foods to look at what are the most nutritious foods to be promoted. Strengthening national agriculture and nutrition research programs in many countries. Biofortification was one of these that national research systems embraced in order to improve the fast delivery of solutions to solve the problem. And so we need a lot more effort in that area. Expanding access to nutrition education was also one of the components. Some of it is done by digital phones, sending messages to pregnant mothers or mothers of young children to assist with the various stages of development. Other systems are supply-driven, where, for example, children's anthropometric measures are entered into a digital system at the clinic, which provides information feedback instantly to the mother and being able to provide information in the system. So education is important, but some of these models are very cleverly designed to increase the ownership. The leadership of women in agriculture is one of the components that also comes in. I've spoken about the availability of data for effective interventions in countries like Rwanda. There's a lot of focus on the different agroecological zones and feeding information in a two-way flow that can help. And then also designing programs that capture the synergies between sectors, so agriculture, water, and sanitation, for example, and then paying attention, which some of these countries are starting to do in terms of overweight and obesity and raising awareness to prevent a future wave of nutrition problems. So in conclusion, the panel drew from these case studies that African governments can address malnutrition, and certainly these 7 provide examples of how it can be done. But unless you prioritize nutrition at the highest level, it's really not going to happen. So it takes concerted effort to maximize and leverage on the benefits, and then also to be able to manage the major constraints that will affect progress on these goals. So that is just in in broad sweeps what the first report is about. And sorry, I forgot to mention right at the beginning, but Patrick Caron is also one of the members of this panel. Thank you, Aldo.
Professor Hendricks, thank you indeed. Two aspects stand out for me is the prioritization at the highest level, which is critical to acknowledge some kind of process for implementation. And secondly, a coherent policy process. We see this starting to move in our own work with the Committee of 10 Heads of State that RU Forum is coordinating with the World Bank and the National Research Foundation on the linkage of higher education and private sector. But it's the principle that is important for me in terms of a real recognition at the right level and the coherency of the policy that will work. It is therefore then very fitting that Dr. Patrick Caron speaks next. He is the chairperson of the high-level panel of experts on world food security to speak to us about SDG 2 and the implementation. Thank you, Patrick.
Well, thank you very much, Aldo. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, dear colleagues, just to make an articulation with what Cheryl just said, Cheryl used to be at the steering committee of the panel until recently. So we had opportunity to also share views, but that's not necessarily what I will talk about. I will much more comment about trends, about what is going on in terms of international and intergovernmental discussions, and especially because 2015 was quite a busy agenda for the high-level panel of experts. But let me just very briefly come back to what is the HLPE about. It has been created in 2010 as a very unique and original animal, an innovative animal. It was created by the UN Committee on World Food Security, which engaged in a reform, and it was created as a way to initiate and structure intergovernmental policy convergence regarding controversial issues for food security and nutrition. So how you can imagine, it means a really incredible faith and incredible responsibility on science. As Professor Swaminathan was saying, he was the first chair, the HLPE has, to make it very brief, has been created to understand better why we disagree on controversial issues. And there are three functions to look at the state of food security and nutrition in the world, number one. Number two, to produce reports, inclusive reports on controversial issues on request from the CFS. And number three, to identify critical and emerging issues for the future in the area of food security and nutrition. So it's a high responsibility on science and knowledge. I assume it's normative, but nonetheless, it's not prescriptive. The reports are the starting point of a policy convergence process. They are not saying what should be done. Well, as chair of the HLPE, I've been invited as a lead discussant for the review of the SDG 2 and hunger during the high-level political forum in New York in UN headquarters in last July. And based on HLP reports, I conveyed 4 messages that I will share with you. Number one, SDG 2 and hunger is at the heart of 2030 agenda. Well, we discussed quite a lot about the new map of malnutrition during the 3 days and the very evolving map with this issue of undernutrition, which is not slowing as quickly as it should, and with the increasing number of the 2 other burden, carence in micronutrients and overweight and obesity. And we know that 1 person in 3 is already affected in all countries of the world, which has, particularly with obesity-related disease, become the #1 problem in public health. So it relates on the one hand to SDG 1, poverty, but on the other hand to SDG 3, health. And behind the legitimate focus on food security and nutrition and paying attention to this new map and the different forms, all the HLP reports have consistently evidenced the tight links between agriculture, food systems, environment health, climate change, welfare, social equity and justice, health, energy, and political stability, all of them, as well as the interlinkages between all SDGs in the overall framework of the 2030 agenda. So when addressing food security and nutrition, which is, of course, legitimate, and we are here for that, we have demonstrated also how it's necessary to take into account causes and modalities and consequences of actions across countries and sectors, whether direct or indirect, short or long distance, short in long term. #2 message, a revolution of food systems, a revolution of food systems. Agriculture will be pivotal for our future because most vulnerable people are poor family farmers, because agriculture is multifunctional and provides much more than just food, human and ecosystem health, decent jobs and income to billions of people, territorial cohesion, peace, political stability, and I could continue. Because although their transformation fortunately repressed the Malthusian prophecy, food production systems are not sustainable. Let's not be shy to admit it. We hear that these systems may move from being a problem to being part of the solution. I do agree. But, well, I suggest to move further and to consider addressing the whole Agenda 2030 by looking at food systems as a lever. But there are two conditions. First, a revolution is needed, not just incremental change. Of the same magnitude as the green one, we were not shy to use the word revolution for the green revolution. Let's continue to use it without succumbing to the illusion of systematic win-win-win. Real change is needed. Paradigms, practice, governance, controversies are central. And secondly, as a condition, agriculture will be a game changer, if the transformation is considered within the wide perspective of food systems, looking at consumption and production all together. #3, a rainbow revolution of food systems. We say it constantly. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. Let's look at the pin, which symbolizes the Agenda 2030. Every color accounts for different SDG, but all together, they constitute a comprehensive framework. Contrarily to the Green Revolution, the needed revolution should be based on pathways adapted to each local context. Yet, all the changes should contribute all together to a global desired transformation. In reference to the pin, I have suggested the name of a rainbow revolution. I've done that here in Cape Town 1 year ago at the Reforum Biennial, and not just by chance. The other symbol I could have used is the South African flag to think about rainbow revolution. And I'm quite sure if Lindiwe is already in the room, she could not more agree. Well, reframing the governance of food systems, because I mentioned revolution, calls for consistent actions at different levels, and not just scaling up of local success stories. We need local innovations. For improving resource efficiency, strengthening resilience, and securing social equity and responsibility. We also need international frameworks, such as voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure, the Paris Agreement on climate, and why not tomorrow, food security-oriented trade patterns. And we need, as evidenced by Cheryl, and I will not be long on that, inclusive and cross-sectorial national policies to ensure the right to food, to boost learning processes, to boost innovation, to address trade-offs, to prevent risk. 4, last message, knowledge at the heart. Anticipating, because we are going to the unknown, and anticipating the unknown will be knowledge intensive, building upon its different forms. This requires a huge investment in research to deliver technology. We do not have, not only to deliver, to design. We do not know everything. We should invest. We should be modern and adapt. To provide relevant metrics, to elicit the rationale of disagreements, to explore possible futures, and to identify critical and emerging issues. As shown by the Committee on Food Security through the mobilization of the HRP, an adapted science policy interface may be instrumental in stimulating the policy debates. So I shared 4 messages. 1, SDG 2 at the heart of a 2030 agenda. 2, a revolution of food system. 3, a rainbow revolution of food system. 4, knowledge at the heart. This was about the analysis of where we are. What about the future agenda? In August 2016, the CFS has requested the HLP to prepare a note on critical and emerging issues for the future in order, and I quote, to provide insights through an evidence-based perspectives built on the knowledge of diverse actors. This note has been sent to the CFS and made public in last April 2017. You can access it. Well, where a critical issue is defined as an issue that has a profound influence on one or more of the dimensions of food security, either directly or indirectly, positively or negatively. And an emerging one as an issue for which there are concerns that they could become critical in the future. And taking into account the input of 3 conferences, building upon available evidence and extensive consultation, we have identified 9 critical issues, and of course we didn't integrate the ones which have been addressed before, like climate change. And DHLP, by the way, considers that the inclusiveness of such a process is also an outcome per se. So there is a list on 9 critical and emerging issues. I will not describe them, you can access them, but just to give you a flavor, one is about the interconnected link between urban and rural transformation. The second is about conflicts and migrations. The third one is about inequalities and vulnerability for food security. The 4 is impact of trades on food security. The 5 is about agroecology. The 6 about agrobiodiversity. The 7 about food safety. And the 8 about the role of technology as a promise. And the 9 about the strengthening of governance of food system at all levels. To conclude, as I said, we are going to the unknown, and the production of knowledge is not only needed, but it's also instrumental in looking at the necessary changes. I hope I do not have difficulty to convince you in a scientific conference about this responsibility. I hope I'm quite sure that here in Cape Town, not quite difficult. Yes, yet I would like to draw your attention that our mission as scientists, if we come to such a conference, is not just the one of producing knowledge and good knowledge. It is also about providing knowledge, production, and offer. And well, it's not about only producing and leaving up to people to uptake it and to do something out of it. The way we formulate our questions matters. The way we format our production, our scientific production, matters. The shape of the arrangement which will use our production matters, whether specific or unintentional. The way we engage, whether at local, national, or international level, in strengthening the intelligence of what happens and in exploring possible future through our production and through foresight arrangements matters. The way we help bridging postures to build a public good matters. And it's not only a question of good political will, of enabling environment, or of a good science policy interface that we will leave the responsibility to others to build. Therefore, as a conclusion, and based on that, I calls upon your reflexivity and ethic in production, in scientific production, to be as efficient as we can when it comes to be present in international discussion. Thank you.
Patrick, really marvelous and inspiring. Thank you indeed. Colleagues, I think it was highlighted how multidimensional the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals are. One very easily sees it only as the 17 to be reached in isolation, but it is a very, very challenging environment. Secondly, the revolutionary approach to the revolution will be necessary at last. And I think it's quite encouraging that it has been acknowledged now at the HLPE that that conceptual approach, if you will, now has been acknowledged and that there's action linked to that, as Cheryl has clearly indicated also with her examples. Thank you very much. Colleagues, we will have a video presentation with PowerPoint of Professor Mandy Rukuni to appraise us of the recent developments in food and nutrition security in Africa. We have indicated that he is unfortunately not able to come. He is very heavily involved in the transition in Zimbabwe, and in a very good way, and also from an agricultural perspective. So we really are pleased that he was still able and will be able to make his presentation. Thank you.
Well, greetings. My name is Mandivamba Rukuni, and my apologies for not making it to the third global conference. I'm a panelist on the Global Trends Commentary session, and my topic is recent developments in food and nutrition security on the African continent. Well, let me start with the status of food and nutrition security in Africa. Estimates 2016 show that at least 150 or so million individuals suffer one way or another from food insecurity in Africa. Although this is still an alarming number, this comes on the backdrop of a situation that's improving in Africa. The one milestone is in the year 2014-2015, Africa is estimated to have actually achieved adequate food to feed everybody on the continent, although this food is poorly distributed. So as Africa advances its food sector and its agricultural sector, the top priority for Africa is really just to build a much more broad-based transformational economy which includes more people. What we have to try to do in Africa is simply to reduce poverty, because poverty is the main cause of food insecurity and nutrition insecurity. So it's good to note that poverty levels have actually declined in Africa, although Africa still has the highest number of poor people in the world, but it's declining. When it comes to nutrition, Africa still suffers from the three nutritional insecurities, that is malnutrition, also undernutrition, as well as obesity. So all those are key policy elements. One of the challenges in Africa is just unstable food markets. Commodity prices that are unstable go up and down, and also an increasing number of natural disasters whether droughts or flooding, and droughts are becoming multi-year droughts as opposed to single-year events several decades ago. So the challenge is to increase resilience, especially given climate change issues. So a major aspect in Africa is promoting and financing programs that promote climate resilience agriculture. As I said earlier, there's been marked improvements in nutrition, although many are still insecure. As a matter of fact, the good news is that in terms of undernutrition, this has declined from about 28% in the year 2000 to about 20% today. The percentage of stunted children decreased from 49% in 1990 to 35% today. So that's progress. But in spite of this progress, population is still rising in Africa. And that population growth means that absolute numbers of stunted children is actually increased from 45 million in 1990 to about 57 million today. The issue of foreign aid is still a major problem for Africa. On one hand, food aid is necessary and useful for serious emergencies and crises. But as a general solution, it is becoming more of a problem because food aid disrupts markets and also disrupts budget processes of countries which don't have stable governance systems. But we know that the donor support for food aid is also dwindling, and this in the short term is a source of further insecurities. But the traditional problem with food aid has been that once a nation gets food aid assistance, there's a tendency for a substitution effect where governments spend less on an issue they should be dealing with because the donors are chipping in. So if there's one major solution, I would say is broadly in the area of policy, broadly speaking, policies in Africa, policies to transform and broaden economies so that most people are going to be logged in, the part of the mainstream economy. But there's been a kind of proliferation of policy frameworks in Africa, partly imported and partly homegrown. So most African countries, as we know, struggled to internalize the MDGs, and now we've got the Sustainable Development Goals. These are somewhat an improvement on the MDGs, but there's still issues. In terms of regional policy frameworks, I suppose the most important one so far has been the Comprehensive African Agriculture Development Program, CAADP. Since 2003 has been the main policy guideline for agriculture in Africa. In the year 2014, the African heads of states actually pushed the CAADP agenda with a Malabo Declaration, which wants to see, is actually a commitment to see Africa food insecure and nutrition secure by 2025. That is a space of 10 years. And this is a very noble program, but once again, poorly implemented. So both global as well as regional policy programs, which actually sound well, are noble, suffer from this problem of poor implementation, which is an issue that I won't have time to go through in detail today, but it's just a way of concluding my statement by suggesting that as Africa improves its agricultural sector, that sector is growing, the economies are also stable and starting to grow again. But in order to really fast-track solutions to food and nutrition insecurity, there's now need for a much more deliberate approach to building inclusive economies, in growing the domestic market, linking smallholder farmers to mainstream markets so that they are not just dependent on side markets. And it is possible then that by 2030, Africa will meet the SDG goal of being food and nutrition secure. Well, thank you very much. And once again, my apologies for not being able to make it physically to the conference. Bye.
Thank you to Professor Rukuni in his absence. I think we must increase the volume of the applause so that he can hear us. So please, let's give another round. Colleagues, we will convey the discussion to Mandy, of course, but the notion of policy implementation is a fundamental component that he has mentioned. There are many policies and overarching guidelines and frameworks. To some extent, Patrick and Cheryl has referred to that already, but the implementation component, together with this notion of foreign aid and foreign food aid specifically. Professor Ekwamu also, as keynote speaker on Monday morning, has mentioned this notion of an almost uncontrollable growth in population rate, and Professor Rukuni has also referred to that. We certainly have our challenges set out very starkly. It's my pleasure then, as the last speaker for the formal inputs to the panel, Professor John Kennelly. We have introduced him as Dean of Agriculture at the University of Alberta in Canada, but also the president of GCHERA, the Global Confederation of Higher Education Associations for Agriculture and Life Sciences, also speaking for the World Agriculture Prize. John, thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here in front of you this morning. It's certainly a big change. This is the view from my window at home in Edmonton, a little different to having the sand blown in my face last night. So really wonderful evening last night, and I don't know if you're like me, I still have these lingering effects of, I think it must have been all that sparkling water that I consumed last night. So this has been a wonderful conference, and in particular, I would like to congratulate the organizers for the thoughtful way that they organized the program, where every aspect of the challenge that we face in food and nutritional security was being looked at, and recognizing so many different players and the interconnectedness amongst those. Now, one area that I did not see in the program, and I hope it's something that in a future conference that may be highlighted, and that is, we talk a lot about the challenge that we face and the fact that humans' ingenuity is going to be required to solve these global challenges around food and nutritional security, but we don't spend a lot of time dealing with the question of, are we doing a good job of preparing our young people to actually deal with those challenges? And I think if we think about our own lives and how important education has been for us in terms of our careers and in terms of our quality of life, I'm sure you don't need any convincing from me to tell you that education is so critical in terms of preparing young people to deal with those challenges. So I think we need to spend more time. This is my message before I get into my presentation, and I was really particularly pleased to hear Professor Adipala talk about this human capacity development. And I think we take it for granted in our institutions, in our universities, that education is our central mission, but we don't spend a lot of time discussing how well we do in delivering on that mission. And clearly, there are many different approaches, and I think some institutions do a very good job of preparing their students, but also we know that in many cases, we are not doing as well as we could in preparing those students. So I think that's an area that I hope will receive more attention in the future. So this morning, I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about Gichera, because not all of you would be familiar with it. And I'm also going to talk to you about the journey that we have taken, that Gichera has taken over the last several years in trying to identify how we can have some impact working with our member associations. And through that process, which culminated in Nanjing in a conference last month, we have identified education as one of the areas that we're going to really focus on. And then at the end of my presentation, I'll say a few words about the World Agriculture Prize. And you heard yesterday about the World Food Prize, and the Gichera World Agriculture Prize is not in competition to that. It is very much complementary and is important, another vehicle for emphasizing the importance of agriculture. So Gichera was established back in 1998. There was a conference in Ukraine, and 60 countries were represented at that conference. And as the conference was winding down, people said there needs to be some sort of global organization that brings together universities so that we can have a common approach on major issues. And so the organization was established, and then between 1999 and 2011, there were 7 global conferences, and the initial makeup of the organization was individual universities as members, and that changed in 2011. So instead of individual members, it was decided to have a regional or national associations making up the membership of Gichera. And one of the reasons for that was that it was very complicated to keep dialogue with what could be up to 900 different universities, and it was felt more appropriate to work with the national associations. So this slide just gives you an idea of the global reach. We have 3 members in Africa. We have North and South America covered, Asia, Europe, and Australia. So our mission, and I should say at the outset that Gichera is very much a virtual organization. We don't have a big secretariat. We are officially registered in Europe. I live in Canada. We have just a tiny budget, and so what we are dependent on is the goodwill of our members and the volunteers, really, to have an impact. And so we are trying to do our best to encourage mutual understanding across our membership, and hopefully the most important thing that we can do, I think, is to facilitate the sharing of best practices, especially in education, but also in research and in outreach. So in addition to that particular aspect, we also have the opportunity as an association to sit on a number of global fora, and this provides also an opportunity for advocacy on behalf of universities, and in terms of the important mission that universities have. Number one, as I said earlier, in terms of education, but also, of course, in research and so on. So we are on the GFAR Steering Committee, Tropical Agriculture Platform, and also we work with groups like the Extension Group, GFRAS, and YPAR, the Young People's Organization, to, again, try and work across those different groups to get the university message across. So that brings me to our conference in Nanjing, China, last month, and similar theme to this conference, but our focus really was, what is the role of universities in actually dealing with this global food security challenge? And the approach we took is that we invited a number of people to present case studies in terms of what their institutions were doing in terms of education, in terms of research and outreach. And of course, in a very short time that I have available, it's not possible to go into great detail. So this morning, I will focus primarily on what our thoughts were in terms of the education role of universities. So with people represented from 6 continents on the program, and our chair this morning was one of the speakers, and John Ingram is down here in the audience as well. He was another one of our speakers. And so I will present a couple of slides that half a dozen slides, just to give you a taste of some of the the interventions from the different speakers. But before doing so, I wanted to give you a little bit of background in the journey that took place prior to our conference in Nanjing. We've been working on this now for several years, trying to decide as an institution, as a GICHERA, what is our role? What should be our action plan? And as I mentioned earlier, through that process, we identified education as being really the key driver in terms of our interventions with our associations and member universities. And the reason we selected education is that there are many different groups that represent the research side in terms of agricultural and environmental sustainability. But you don't find very much discussion, as I said earlier, happening on the education side, even though we all implicitly believe that it's the core mission of universities. We don't spend a lot of time talking about it, and we don't always measure how effective we are in terms of that most important product that we produce, which is the students that leave our doors and go on to careers and to make a difference in society. So again, time doesn't permit me to go into detail, but when you think about reform of undergraduate programs or graduate programs, it's not just about an individual course. You need to think of your whole institution. How committed is the higher administration? And it's not just about the strength of a particular discipline. It's really about the pedagogy, how you approach it, the environment you create for students, and hopefully at the end of that process, you have an outcome which is not just a person that is an expert in some technical aspect, but a much broader education which provides those all-important soft skills, which are really what allow that person to negotiate the complexity of the challenges that we face in society. So it was interesting in Nanjing that when we looked at what are the characteristics of the kinds of people that we want to be tackling the challenges that we face in this century, that it was very similar to what GICHERA had come up and as part of its action plan. And you will notice, and I think you will agree, that it's not just, as I said earlier, it's not just about knowledge, it's about those skills and it's about those ethical values. On Sunday, I was at the discussion on conflict, and I couldn't help thinking, are we doing enough in our universities to promote harmony, to promote goodwill, to get our students involved in international activities so they have a better appreciation and understanding of other cultures? So again, all of those things become very important in terms of how effective we are in terms of preparing those graduates for whatever careers that they decide to pursue. And of course, the careers nowadays, traditionally, maybe many universities were preparing people for the public service, but those jobs have really fallen off. And so we want people that are be able to function in the private sector, but also, of course, to be people that create new businesses and create work for other people as well. As I mentioned, we had a broad discussion, and I don't have time today to get into that final column there, value creation. Some people call it extension. But one of the things that our speaker from Wageningen mentioned is that universities nowadays, the expectations of universities in terms of what they do are much greater than was the case historically. We have to be seen to be making a difference in society because people don't just accept our word for it. So the extent to which university connects with its community, the extent to which our students are actually out there in that community as part of their experiential learning, that is a very important part of the impact of the university. And Robert Dyball from Australia, for example, again talked about the same theme in terms of preparing the students. And at the end of the day, it's not just the focus on the student being the vessel that we, the professors, fill with knowledge. It's really about creating the right environment so that you facilitate that learning and hopefully produce lifelong learners that can deal with the complexity of the issues that we are facing. Very interesting that our chair, I have 2 slides from his presentation, which talked about the very specific problems that Africa faces. And, very rapidly growing population, young people, the challenges of finding employment, and so on. these are really critical issues that this continent needs to address, that several speakers mentioned during this conference, and I thought that Aldo did a tremendous job in highlighting those. Again, the challenge of budgets. You know, you have a growing university student population. The budgets don't match that growth. And at the same time, the participation rate of young people in tertiary education in Africa is much lower than the global participation rate. And of course, you have the challenge that in terms of research, graduate students, especially PhD students, are the key drivers of research. And so if you don't have many students involved in those graduate programs, then you face a challenge as well. So these are things that, and I was very happy, by the way, to see this consensus report. I think it was on Monday, I believe. On your seat, you had the Academy of Science South Africa, and the chair of that group was Franz, who was with us here this morning. And I think it's worth reading this report. I know it's focused on South Africa, but I think the implications are not just for Africa, but globally. So I think it's certainly worth reading. John Ingram talked about, we talked about all these challenges. So John, being very practical, said, okay, what do we do about it? And again, talked about the hard and soft skills, the food systems approach, and ended up talking about what they are doing in terms of food systems thinking with a group of universities in the UK who are going outside their own borders, bringing students together across institutions to facilitate that dynamic learning environment, to expose students to different ways of thinking, to expose them to industry and so on. And through that, those students, when they graduate, were much better prepared for careers. Again, I don't have time to go into detail. So to summarize the key conference outcomes then, a consensus across all speakers that there is an urgent need for reform and skills development. And even though technical knowledge is important, in particular, that we need to do more to develop those soft skills. And this is a theme, I think, that came through again, that I keep emphasizing. It's not just about technical skills, it's about those soft skills so that people can navigate the complexity that we are faced with. So next step as an organization, GICHERA is working with a foundation to launch a pilot project in Mexico and Haiti based on curriculum reform and pedagogy. And we are trying to help interested institutions to develop those skills, those soft skills. And over time, it's our hope to expand that pilot project to other institutions. The foundation that is supporting us particularly wanted to start in Mexico and Haiti, but we would love to link with RUForum, for example, in terms of the work that's going on in Africa as a way of expanding this project, because our goals are very much the same. So very briefly, in terms of this pilot project, it's modeled actually on EARTH University, which is a small university in Costa Rica that I know RUForum is quite familiar with. And it's not that they have the only approach that works. There are many different approaches, and as Patrick said earlier, there's no single way of doing things, but their model certainly has shown to be quite successful. And so again, you will see that when they look at their formative pillars, it's not just knowledge, it's just one of the things that they look at. And actually, when they set up their programs, even the students, the entrance to the university is not just based on academic performance, it's very much about people's aptitude and interest in agriculture and life sciences. And of course, experiential learning, student-centered learning is an important component of that. So the very nice thing about their graduates, they come from about 40 different countries. Most of them go back to their home country, which is not always the case for international students that come to Canada, for example, or the US or Europe. And that they have a positive impact in their local environment. And they also, many of them, 20% of them, actually start their own company, which again, as part of that education, that's part of the requirement that they have to be entrepreneurs, they have to look at creating new job opportunities in their community. So that's the model that we're going to work on. We're very interested if universities in Africa, for example, or anywhere in the world actually, that are interested in this, GICHERA will keep connect. If you let us know, we'll keep you connected with this project, and so that hopefully we can spread the net, if you like, and expand to other areas of the world, again, within the context of sharing of best practices. So finally, 2 slides left on the World Agriculture Prize. This was conceived in 2011 between Nanjing Agricultural University and Gichera, and the idea was, again, similar to what the World Food Prize is, except this one is focused primarily on universities and scientists in universities. And you have the list there of people, the first 5 years of the program, and it came with the award came with a $50,000 US prize. And for next year, we're very happy to say that with the support of a private company and Nanjing Agricultural University, we're able to expand the award. There's going to be 2 awards, and each will come with a $100,000 US prize. And as I mentioned, they recognize the lifetime contribution of an individual. So we would encourage you to, I know that there are deserving people at this conference that would be worthy laureates. So again, encourage you to think about nominating deserving individuals. So ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege for me to stand before you this morning. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Professor John Kennelly, thank you indeed. For me, this notion of capacity development and human development is probably a cross-cutting theme among everything that we are discussing. Without the capacity, we cannot build the capacity. And the stark issues of gender differentiation, youth, unemployment, those are aspects that will contribute to exacerbating our challenges. But we need to redirect so that they can assist and solve the challenges. Colleagues, I liked these discussions very much. We started with Professor Cheryl Hendricks that provided an overview of the Malabo-Montpellier agreement and the reports, very clear indications of the case studies and the progress that have been made in the countries that was highlighted. Dr. Patrick Aron focusing slightly more on SDG 2, as this is the current focus of the high-level panel of experts, but that has also highlighted the intricacies and the multimodality of all the SDGs as it must contribute. Professor Mandy Rukuni provided an overview of the current progress and achievements with food and nutrition security in Africa, on the continent, but very specifically this notion of the implementation of the implementation ability of policies to be much more successful to increase the level of progress that we want to see. And of course, this notion of human capital development, universities, the role of institutions in fulfilling the gap of capacity by Professor John Kennelly. It really came together in a very strategic way if we want to put this under the notion or the banner of global trends. And the commentaries that has been made has certainly highlighted to a very good extent what these global trends are. I would like to ask for 2 questions and have a more comprehensive response from the panel. So kindly make your way, if you feel like it, to one of the microphones on the side. And let's please just have 2 very profound questions, if you don't mind, for our panel to respond to then as a group. Please, sir, and introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is John Mumba. I'm a nutritionist from Zambia, working under Netherlands Development Organization. Mine is not a question, but rather, I think what I've been yearning to hear from this conference has actually come out. So I think I'm going back home, I'm going back to Zambia, very satisfied with the panel. I mean, everything I was looking forward to hearing has actually come out. So kudos to the professors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm Justin Rasa from Tanzania. My comment is that I wish, let's say, ministers from the agricultural ministries and Minister of Education were here, or even the technocrats. Now we've talked about very good things, but perhaps it will be very difficult for me, let's say, to convince the Minister of Agriculture in Tanzania or the Minister of Higher Education to take up these things. But I hope in the next meeting for this global food security or whatever, at least some invitation could be sent to those really responsible ministers so that these things we talk about, which are very important for food security and the well-being of the youth and the future generations, will be taken up. You know, as yesterday it was said, a prophet is not normally honored in their own places. So if they came and heard it from other people, then it could have been nice. So hopefully conference organizers think of inviting those ministers or communicating to them the outcomes of this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I would very much like to comment myself on your comment, but I will leave it up to the panel first, and if there's time, make my own contributions. Colleagues, in any order that you would like, the two questions, thank you for the acknowledgement, sir. I think it's very much appreciated on the approach of the conference. But I think your question is very pertinent on the policy component. You have listed a long and intimidating list of to-do. We have secondly seen the progress of each of those. But it sometimes creates the impression that if it is not at that policy level, there is not the movement that we would like to see. Your insights will be appreciated.
Okay, I will start. I would agree that a big challenge is getting our message across to people that actually fund universities and that are involved in policy. So this is an ongoing struggle. We can only continue that. However, at the same time, it's been interesting for me when I've gone to foundations to try and fund some of the work that Gichara wants to do. One of the comments that came up time and time again was something along the lines of, universities are very slow to change. You're reluctant to do new things. Our experience with universities has not been the greatest in terms of being nimble and changing things like curriculum, etc. So I think even though it's obviously critical to get additional funding from government and get government support and policymakers, there are things we can do ourselves that don't require outside intervention. We can sit down with our colleagues and look at our curriculum and ask the question, are we using our existing resources in the most effective way in terms of preparing our students? So I think even though it's tempting to always look at the other guy and to say, why are they not helping us? I think we can do a lot more at the same time to help ourselves as well.
Thank you. I also think we need to look at ourselves and see how we communicate the research that we do. Because for us to connect with policymakers, we need to make our connection with them. And that's usually through building relationships, which takes time. It's a big investment. And so creating platforms for that kind of engagement takes time in countries. But where it's supported by national research systems that align research directions with national priorities, for example, you're able to create inroads into government in far more constructive ways. I think the example was the report that Aldo presented, where you do have the ear of the minister because that's what they want to hear. But sometimes we're not responsive, and sometimes our turnaround time is far too slow. So we're doing retrospective analysis instead of being in the moment and being quick to do what we do. And so I think we need to think about how we do business in research, how we communicate that, and how we build those relationships to do it. But certainly if you've got a Malaba Montpellier panel person from your country, the panel would be most willing to and keen to engage with your decision makers, and that can be facilitated from the chairs. So there are opportunities.
You mentioned ministries, so you think about the national level. And as a geographer, I'm obsessed by the way of acting at different levels consistently in the same time. So, of course, I could not more agree with this building process at the national level and the role science could play in it. I would also very much urge for involvement in local arrangements to design and to experiment. And what I try to express is that there is a role as well at the intergovernmental and international level. So let me just take a few examples to make it concrete, because if I stay very abstract and theoric, as I did it in a short term, that it might be just a dream or an illusion, but I of course believe it can come true. I would take two examples. Well, Jessica Fanzo was here at the beginning of the week, and she was the team leader of a report from the HLP, which has been quite recently produced and discussed at the level of the CFS. The CFS is an intergovernmental body which is somehow inclusive and which reports to ECOSOC. So it brings governments together. It brings ministers together. If you look at this report, first of all, the request has derived from an intergovernmental negotiation. It just didn't come on the table by chance. And then, as consequences of the report, there has been one particular issue that has been brought on the table, which is very strongly based on the report. The report identifies 3 entry points in food systems for food security and nutrition. One is the one we quite know about. It's food supply. Another one is another one we quite know about, which is consumers' choices and preference and behavior and their consequences in terms of nutritional status. And the third one, which was quite interesting in this report, was to identify the notion of food environment. Food environment is all the drivers and infrastructure that impact on choices, on preferences, like, if I provide examples, advertisement, education, taxes, subsidies on healthy or unhealthy products. And as a consequence of the first step of the delivery of this report, governments have agreed to embark on the preparation of voluntary guidelines on food environment, exactly like it was done some years ago about land tenure. That means to agree at the intergovernmental level on voluntary guidelines. Of course, every country will then apply or not apply in very different ways, but that's exactly a type of example that, as a scientific community, we can contribute to. And another one is when I mentioned the issue of critical and emerging issue, and I listed the 9 issues, you probably have noticed that there is one about agroecology. And agroecology has been then, since the publication of this report, has been selected through an intergovernmental negotiation as the next one report to be delivered. That is to understand better what we do agree, what we do not agree, what are elements for decision making. And that will be brought back at government's level for further negotiation. So I just want to share with you my very strong conviction that as scientists, there are many channels to really interact with policymakers and decision makers at local level, at national level, at intergovernmental level. And we should really be very active in that.
Colleagues, this is a global trends commentary, and maybe this will be an unfair question for a last round of responses to the panelists. And your current reports and engagements will change in 20 years. But can you please share with us your 2 sentences on what your measure of success will be in 20 years of your current engagement? High-level panel, Patrick, Malabo Montpellier Forum, and from a Gichera capacity, perspective, very briefly, but what would you see as your key measure of success in 20 years?
I at least to have one, and I would put high. It's a dream, it's a wish to make sure that well, if I say it in very trivial terms, it's to make sure that the connection between science and policy is strengthened. But that can be turned into very measurable and verifying criteria, that is the uptake of what we create as an intelligence to move forward, and vice versa, the mechanism by which policy making and decision makings call upon researchers to be part of looking and designing the agenda for the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. For me, it would be to see a change in the introductions to papers on Africa that don't say Africa's a miserable basket case and that there are so many millions starving, but actually an upbeat story of Africa was able to succeed in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and bringing about policy change that can be used as examples for other parts of the world.
Excellent, thank you.
For me, it's that we have solved, to a largely, the challenges that we're talking about here, and we have done so because we've prepared our young people, given them the tools, the skills, to actually take innovative approaches that we maybe have neglected up to now. So, as I said, I think it's all about the young people and how we prepared them to be the problem solvers.
And I don't want to speak for Professor Rukuni, but his response would have been a very loud laugh and an acknowledgement of the very long list that he would like to see in 20 years. But I think, Cheryl, your response would have been very much in line with what Mandy would have said. Please join me in thanking our excellent panel, colleagues. Thank you very much. The plenary is continuing. We will ask Professor Ndiko Ludidi from the Department of Biotechnology at the University of the Western Cape to please join on stage and ask his speakers also to join him. Colleagues, you would have seen on the program there would have been power presentations of a short list of posters during lunch. We have taken a collective decision to forfeit that. Thank you very much for your valuable voting, which is closed yesterday afternoon for the best posters. We will gather those individuals who've been notified already, and they will be acknowledged during the closing session of the conference this afternoon. I would also just like to ask then that, especially everyone who had posters, to check their emails if there should be an indication. Thank you for participating in this session.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So I have been given a rather easy task, and that is to chair a session that reflects on key issues relating to human development and food security. And as a start to that, I would like to first briefly introduce the first speaker, who happens to be Professor Julian May from the University of the Western Cape, here in South Africa. Professor Julian May is the director of the NRF DST Center of Excellence in Food Security at UWC. It's very difficult to say anything in 5 minutes about Julian, I think. So I will not go through the very extensive biography of who he is. I will simply highlight that during his 30-year career, he has worked on options of poverty reduction, including land reform, social grants, information technology, and urban agriculture in Africa and in the Indian Ocean Islands. He has also worked on development and use of systems for monitoring the impact of policy, using statistics, impact assessment, and action research. His focus currently is on food security, child deprivation, and child malnutrition, and malnutrition in general. And the reason why I say I wouldn't really try to cover everything that he has done is that his experience is reflected in the previous work that he has done in association with several universities in the UK, in Germany, in France, and being a member of expert group meetings that involved the World Bank, which he has consulted for, and also his involvement with different aspects within the United Nations. And of course, in that 30-year career, which happens to be my age, he has been involved in associate editorships for 2 major journals that deal with the aspects of the research that is involved in. And I know Julian only has 20 minutes, but I am confident that in that 20 minutes, he will be able to tell us, or at least answer the following question: is food security a public good, and why does it matter? I hope Julian will be able to give us some insight into that within 20 minutes. Professor Julian May.
Having sat through that introduction twice now, I probably should also say that I cook, I garden, and I've been married for 34 years. So colleagues, 4 years ago, I stood in front of a conference which I was the co-chair of, also to 600 people. And I had to do the most difficult thing I'd ever done in my life. I had to present an obituary for Mr. Nelson Mandela, who died 4 years ago yesterday. In that presentation, I reflected not on Mr. Mandela's role as the president of South Africa, but his role also as an activist and what that meant, and the choices that he made during his life. So while I talk, perhaps just reflect on what Mandela offered this planet and this country, and perhaps think then what are our roles as scientists, but also possibly activists. Okay, so my question then is food security a public good? I'm an economist, and in thinking about what food security is, I've had to think about then how would I approach that within the confines of my discipline. I think we've heard a number of conundrums presented at this conference. The conundrum that bothers me is how is it, in the context of there being enough food in this world, and with the scientific expertise that is represented in this room, how is it that there is still hunger and malnutrition? And I think we need to try and work through what is the reason for that. I think economics can give us some clues as to why that might be the case. So let me start off, and maybe it's a bad start in a room where I suspect there are people that were involved in writing this definition of food or writing the definition of food security, but to say, although this is useful and although it is popular, it is an aspirational list that doesn't necessarily help us determine what are the practices that we need to do. And in fact, we might want to start thinking about some of the alternative ways in which food is represented and which food security is being defined. So I put 2 ideas up here, one by an anthropologist, which thinks about food not as the things that go into it, the ingredients, but the social and political and economic factors that drive food. and another view from Amartya Sen and Jean Dries, which says something about what food security is and recognizes the role of human capabilities rather than necessarily only the production of the things that go into food. Now that definition I think is helpful because when we think about more conventional approaches for food security, the recommendations that come out of that are largely agnostic about the kind of food system we would like to have. Instead, the problem is often conceptualized as needing to increase food production, needing to reduce its financial cost, and needing to be able to ensure that it is safe when it is eaten. It's not recognizing then that many of the problems of food security emanate outside of the food system itself. So three that I'm particularly interested are poverty, inequality, and patriarchy. We've heard gender mentioned once or twice on this conference. We've heard inequality, I think, not mentioned at all, and we've heard poverty mentioned once or a few times. So we need to then think these then are underlying drivers that even if we do produce enough food, even if we do have the scientific knowledge, will still hinder our ability to provide food security, to provide the capability not to be food insecure. So that diagram, I think, has often been put up, the idea of the access, availability, and agency of food. It provides us with some way to start. Agency is, in fact, not yet used as often as I think it ought to be. And that is the ability of humans to be able to make choices about their food and to be able to influence the food system itself. So, I'd like to put up an alternative food insecurity definition. And I'm afraid because I come from a background of researching poverty, it is very influenced by how we think about poverty. And it sees food insecurity as a form of deprivation and an outcome of vulnerability. It's multidimensional. Its intensity will vary over time. Its duration varies. It has an absolute, relative, and subjective component. And critically, there is culpability in the production of food insecurity, and there is duty in resolving it. I think we are part of those that have a duty to do something about food insecurity, and I think that our presence here shows that we know that. Then, what is food? Okay, so we can think about food as that list of ingredients, but typically that's not at least how economists think. A critical feature of food is that it is predominantly privately produced and privately purchased. It therefore then fits into what we call the primary scarcity problem of economics. In other words, the resources that we have to produce food, the food itself is finite, but our desires are insatiable. In other words, there we have to start relying on signals to tell us how to allocate resources and how to allocate the food that is produced. In addition, it means that food is rivalrous and it is exclusive. In other words, when we queue to get our food at the break in a little while, if I eat and I get there first and there isn't enough food, you will not eat. And if I push you away or we crowd around the food, you will be at the back of the queue and you will not eat. So that is a very important thing, because then one way of solving that problem is if they would charge us for the food, and our desire would then be reflected in how much money are we willing to pay. And if you're South African and they charge us in rand, I will be able to pay. And if you're carrying Rwandan shillings, you will not be able to pay unless they are willing to accept that as currency. If you had Bitcoin and the Bitcoin bubble has burst, you might have a problem. So what does that, we need to think then that if food is a commodity, then it's generated from a system of capitalist production, and there are those that might say that food then, the problems of food insecurity result from the fact of, as Marx said, a food system that runs counter to rational agriculture. That statement was because if you are in a system where your concerns are the short-term production, the realization of the maximum income that you have, you're unlikely to protect land so it's going to be there for the next generation. Your time horizon is much lower. If you are a company, you're going to be concerned about maximizing the profits for your shareholders and care less about the consequences, because others will bear those consequences. It does lead some researchers then to say that the problem of food security is the irrationalities and contradictions of the capitalist management of agriculture and the food system, and to say until we have a different system, we can't do anything. It's also led people to say, well, consumers are collaborators in this, because consumers desire not the food of necessity, but the food of luxury. And so as a result, the diets that consumers desire are those that are based upon imported staples, such as that go into bread, rice, fast foods, sugary and salt-intensive food, fat-laden foods. These are the kinds of things then that consumers would like to have. But we have to acknowledge that capitalism has done an extremely good job of dealing with the drudgery of producing food. It has provided us with financially cheap food, and it has improved the conditions under which food has been produced. Capitalism has been a lot less successful in the stewardship of the resources used to be able to produce food. It has not been as successful in ensuring the stability of the prices, and it has not provided diets that are balanced, affordable, and healthy for all. Because that's not necessarily how markets work. So we have to think then, since we are almost certainly going to have some variant of capitalist production continuing to provide us with our food system, what then are the underlying forces that underpin a market-based economy? Now, in the case of food and food security, there are numerous market imperfections and numerous positive and negative externalities that enter in the production of food. So markets do not necessarily work well, particularly markets for natural resources, markets which are things which are publicly shared, like the health of our planet, the health of our oceans. Positive and negative externalities, well, if I enjoy safe food, you will also enjoy safe food. It is impossible for me to prevent you from enjoying that. On the other hand, if I produce polluted water in the production of food, those downstream are going to pay the costs. We also have to recognize that food access and its stability depends upon food value chains in which there are immense inequalities of power and of information and of money. Now, price signals, which is what economists say allow for us to have an efficient system of production, don't work well when we have such signals. The price signals that we expect tend to react and do not necessarily show us all of the costs or all of the externalities that are involved in the production of food. In particular, when some resources are in fact public resources under the stewardship of those who are producing, so the water, the land, ultimately those who are producing are stewards of those resources, then we also find that there are not necessarily incentives to be able to look after that, or after those goods. So, practically, what does this mean? So again, my discipline at least allows me to think about that, and that is to recognize the difference between food, a private good, and food security, which I'd like to suggest is a public good. In other words, my consumption of food security does not prevent you from consuming food security. It is difficult for many aspects of food security for me to exclude you from the benefits of food security. So, that might be the economics theory. Perhaps a simpler way to think about that, and some researchers do this, is to say that society can also deem some private goods as being de facto public in their consumption. We can declare some things as being a right. And we've actually declared food and food security to be a right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So, if for no other reason, our leaders have decided that food security is a public good. And that means that food security is both a national and a global public good, at least in the eyes of society. Okay, all good. But to go back to my first point, food itself is not a private good. And that means that food security then becomes the joint product. It is produced both by private action, the action of farmers who are entrepreneurs, the action of district food producers, irrespective of the size of the firm and the entrepreneurship of distributors, again, irrespective of the size of the enterprise. Again, in the language of economics, we then say that such goods are impure public goods. Now, impure public goods have an interesting characteristic. They are subject to collective action problems. Now, in a collective action problem, that means that although we may have a common concern, we may react in different ways, and we may pursue those concerns in different ways. We also might have different short-term objectives, even though we may share a common long-term objective. It means that somehow if we are all concerned about food security, we're going to have to find ways of working together, even though we have different interests in mind. And institutions are the way in which we work together. You can think about institutions are structures which allow us to live together. The marriage of 34 years is an example of an institution that has been enduring. Now, institutions need, in the language of Amartya Sen, capabilities, collective capabilities, ways in which we are able to operate together. So my wife and I have collective capabilities. When we married, we drew up a list of all the activities that relate to keeping our house in order, keeping our home in order. We divided that list equally, and we traded. I was not aware that my wife dislikes defrosting freezers, and she was not aware that I dislike cleaning toilets. So she was happy to trade the freezer, and I was happy to trade the toilet. That is an institution. That is an arrangement of living together. So collective action problems have one important characteristic. They permit free riding. The illustration gives you some sense of what free riding might mean, but essentially, I can benefit from the work of someone else without making any effort of my own. And that is certainly true in the case of food security. We all benefit from the work of the farmers who produce our food, and we're only required to wear a suit and stand up in front of a conference. We don't have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and be concerned about the latest armyworm infestation. In some senses, we are among the free riders in the food system because we are not, in fact, bearing the true cost of food. We heard some people comment about the production of oranges and the consumption of oranges in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom consumer is not bearing the true cost of consuming that orange. Now, I've tried to argue that food, at least from an economist's perspective, is a public good, a particular kind of public good, that is one that is impure. If it's impure, that means that there's a possibility of free riding. We have to resolve collective action problems. Now, when I started thinking about food security, I was very attracted by the notion of a food system. And I've drawn various diagrams to be able to help me think through what a food system is. This is one such diagram, trying to recognize that the individual and household choices are part of a complex and nested system of other structures, which might include the farm and factory in which food is produced, the cabinet of governments and the courts where decisions are taken, and ultimately the biosphere where the food is produced. And as I started thinking about food systems, I started thinking, well, it's really complex because the food system interacts with other kinds of systems, the ecological system, the microbial system, the energy system. And then eventually there was a flash and I thought it's really, really complex because these systems are systems in their own right and they're now starting to they change and they're dynamic. And while reductionism is not particularly helpful, as I started to drift into the madness of increasing complexity, that also stopped being particularly helpful. So I started thinking, well, what does this complexity do to the evidence that we need to be able to make decisions about complexity? Well, it means that perspective matters. It depends on what evidence you use, how you interpret that evidence, what value you give to evidence, what value you give to competing evidence, and how you make those kinds of choices. So it brings me to an elephant in the room, which is starting to try and think, well, what is the food security problem? What is its nature? And even the elephant is hard to figure out. And I'll spare you the usual story of the elephant's trunk and leg, because in the context of food security, knowing which leg is which and how it connects to the actual elephant may also be pretty difficult. So there was a literature that some have mentioned, and I think in the context of food security, it certainly was something which came out of development planning literature, and that was to start to think about certain kinds of problems that are wicked. So I think many people are engaged in the very complex business of scientific problems which require you to work in your laboratories. Some of you, I'm sure, are doing DNA sequencing, which is extremely complicated. But in the notion of wicked problems, those are tame problems. In other words, a wicked problem doesn't have indefinite formulation of it. It has no stopping rule. You solve a wicked problem when you run out of money. There's not a right and wrong solution. There's a continuum of solutions. There's no test to know whether your solution is actually going to work. Your problem might be unique. It might be specific to Cape Town now. Problems might be symptoms of other problems. There are multiple explanations of the problems. Your attempts to solve the problem count. When you do an intervention, it may create more problems and new problems. And as a result, solvers of problems, us, are culpable for our solutions. And the literature goes a little further, and it says there are such things as super wicked problems, or messes. I really like the notion of saying something's a mess. And that might be the case with food security, because they say if a super wicked problem, time is running out. Those who are causing the problem are trying to solve the problem, and the central authority is weak or non-existent. So, collective action problems, here's a list of some of the things that we're going to have to confront if we're dealing with a wicked problem from a complex system that's impure and a public good. We need to deal with problems of coordination, cooperation. How do we find agreements? We have to deal with the problem of actually a fundamental uncertainty about causes and consequences, and we have to deal with an issue of bounded rationality. Again, a concept borrowed from economics, but bounded rationality is where issues are so complex that the time taken to get the information to be able to make a good decision is not available, and as a result, we either do what we've always done, we take a solution from something else and say, it'll work here, or we declare the problem solved and hope it will go away. So, we may have problems that are so complex that you can't make a decision about them, or you may think about adjusting your attitude towards the problem. I've always wanted to quote Jack Sparrow in a conference. So, I also like Dilbert. We need to think whether we are solving the wrong problem. And we need to think then quite carefully, how do we figure out how to solve the problem? And Chair, I noticed the red light flashing at me. I'm nearly done. One of the things we could think about is developing the capabilities that allow us to be able to solve the food insecurity problem. And here's a list of capabilities that our research has identified from engagements with government. So I'm going to quite quickly move from what may have sounded like a lot of theory to where, in fact, we have been working with governments at different levels in South Africa and elsewhere in the continent, of being able to transfer what are the things that we need to be able to do into beings. Now remember, for those of you who have studied Amartya Sen, we need to be thinking about beings and doings. It goes back to Cheryl's point. We need to be doing something now. It's time to move beyond only thinking. So there's a list. I'm not going to read them to you. I hope you've had enough time to look at them. I'd like to just pick on the last one, because one of the key beings I think we need to be reflecting on is how do we provide empathetic policies and products. By empathetic, I mean products and policies that try to take into account the situation of those for whom we are designing. Too often we design something like this, and where you find that the fingerprint device at the back is too far away for your hand to reach if you've got small hands. So in fact, a phone like this is not a good phone for women who may have smaller hands than men. Empathetic design may have actually been able to sort that problem out, and I think we need to think about empathetic design also in the context of our field. There's a list of things of what to do. This paper is published in Food Research International, an Elsevier publication, and I'm sure there you can go through the list of solutions that I've proposed here. But it's something about also figuring out who the actors are, convening them in some way, recognizing that solutions range from good to bad, establishing which problems are the symptoms of other problems, listening to the multiple narratives and explanations of those problems. Different actors will explain them in different ways, and we will need to understand why they think the problem is this and caused by that rather than the other way around. We need partnering. We need to find ways of working together, and that means working together as scientists, with the private sector, with government, with civil society, and with uncivil society. Recall my comment about Nelson Mandela. At some point, Nelson Mandela decided to join uncivil society, and he was imprisoned for a very long time because of that commitment. We need ways of agreeing on how to check on the outcomes. We need to be able to modify our outcomes and respond. We possibly need an ombudsman in food security, a neutral body that others may trust. We need to assign and accept the roles and responsibilities and the culpabilities of food production, and that includes simple things like providing insurance for those that are making decisions. Why does it matter? Well, one of the things that matters in a collective action problem is what we refer to as the prisoner's dilemma. If we don't do this, the underlying imperatives of making decisions are likely to mean that we will make decisions that mean all of us lose. We will maximize our short-term prospects and lose against our long-term. Now, I'll end on this slide. As scientists, we are actors in this. We also respond to price signals. We react to grants where the money is. We redirect our research. We react to the incentives that we have. Cheryl mentioned a very important thing. If we are to succeed in doing anything with food security, we need long-term relationships with policymakers. That's not going to help your H-index, huh? That's not going to get you cited. And that is a huge investment which we would need to be made. And at the moment, our incentive systems mean we are a little bit like the rats in the cage, and we chase the grant money too often. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the tolerance for the extra time. I apologize to the next speaker.
Thank you, Professor May, for a very insightful answer to a complex question. I found it very interesting that equality has only been touched on in the conference only very slightly. It's very clear that even if we were to produce enough food, the problem still remains. Would that food be accessible to all? And I think you have shown us how we can deal with that particular problem. And it seems it lies on how our economic and social systems work. But I will not labor on the issue. And in the interest of time, I would like to introduce our next speaker. You would have noticed that this particular part of this session was supposed to be delivered differently, but you will also find that the speaker that is going to touch on this particular topic will do justice as well. And in fact, the question that she will be dealing with is just as complex as the one that Professor May has dealt with. Professor Alice Pearl is from the Department of Animal Science at Cornell University. And despite the fact that Cornell University is on the other side of the world, she actually serves Africa very well in terms of postgraduate training, research, and the impact of her work on food security. She is an animal scientist by training, but her work goes beyond just the animal science. And today, she will also answer one pertinent question, and that is our food system a functional food system, or is it a dietary disaster? Professor Pearl.
Well, good morning. I'm obviously not Lawrence Haddad and will not be talking about GAIN, but I have been doing a lot of work with food systems, so that I think that we will cover some of the same terrain, but we'll go down some different paths. I'd like to, as I start, I had a fellowship at STIAS, and a lot of the work contained in this presentation was from work that I did there, and it is a wonderful place to spend time thinking. The focus of this talk is on food systems. That's sort of in vogue at the moment. I think that one of the things that we haven't talked about very much is why we have the food system. And obviously, the primary objective is human well-being because people have good nutrition. And it's very easy to get shutted off into crop yields or different aspects. But if we keep people at the very center of what our focus is, I think we'll end up with a more robust system. I'm going to take a little bit of a historical perspective going back to the 1960s and look at how we looked at food systems at that time. The general assumption was if we produced enough food, this hunger problem would kind of go away. As a result, people in agriculture had their own jargon. People in nutrition were talking about things like hemoglobin and stunting and things like that. And if you'd talked to an agriculturalist, they would have had no idea what stunting was. There wasn't much discussion of how you got the food from the field onto the plate, and equally importantly, into the human being. There was a kind of black box. And the result was yields did improve, particularly in South Asia, due to the Green Revolution. I don't think we want to discount that because a lot of lives were saved. However, there was very little discussion about nutrition. I think that we need to recognize that since the Green Revolution period, a lot has changed. Population has increased. In 1960, a quarter of Africans lived in cities. By 2014, it was a little over half. By 2050, it will be 2/3 of the population. Most of the global improvements in increases in urbanization are in Africa and Asia. The mega cities like Mumbai are going to become more common. It may also be, as was a point made this morning, that smaller cities also develop well, or increase in size. A third of the undernourished children today are living in cities. So if we're worried about child nutrition, we've got to look at both rural and urban areas. During this conference, one of the things that we've sort of talked about a traditional system and what we need for the future. That traditional system has been changing. The first time I came to Africa was actually in the late 60s, and the agricultural systems then are very different from what we have now, even though there are parts of the continent that still look very traditional. There have been changes in production, what's produced, how it's produced. There have been big changes in processing, marketing, distribution, and what people eat. And I think we need to be looking at that and taking that into account as we go forward. And we also need to look forward 20 years or so if we're going to be educating students for the future and if we're going to be planning for where we want to be 20 years from now. In the 1960s, we didn't talk about climate change. Obviously, that is something that we're going to have to reckon with seriously. So here I have a very simple emerging food system model. There are many out there. We could spend a lot of time arguing what should be in which box. We're not going to do that. But what I want to do is to make the point. We talk a lot about the integration of agriculture and nutrition as though we know what to do. Do we take the bushel of corn or maize from the field and simply put it on the dinner table? No. We need to look at each of these boxes. The impact that processing has on the nutritional value of food is tremendous. Whether we buy our food, whether we produce our food, whether we buy it locally from a small market, or whether we go to a large supermarket, affects the type of food that we have access to. What happens at the family level also is important. So I want to spend this time looking at the factors that are affecting this comprehensive view of a food system and what we need to do to ensure that everyone gets the food that they need. These are a couple of sort of scary facts. Obesity has increased tenfold in the last 40 years. That's fast. About a fifth of all 5 to 19-year-olds globally are overweight, and that includes the obese. Body mass index has increased in all countries, and no countries have actually satisfactorily been able to decrease body mass index. We've made good progress in reducing the rate of undernutrition. We have not got the solutions to overnutrition. And this last figure was from The Economist a couple of weeks ago about by 2022, that is just about 4 years from now, there will be more obese people than undernourished people globally. These are frightening figures, and it means that no longer are we talking about obesity is a rich country disease. In fact, obesity has really become a disease of poverty, and we'll come back to talking about that. It's because of some of the changes in the food system, particularly in the processing areas. And these are things that we need to be reckoning with now. We've talked a lot at this conference about the triple burden of nutrition. One of the consequences of that is there's been a fourfold increase in the amount of diabetes since 1980. Diabetes is a long-term, chronic, debilitating disease. And it's something that we really have to get a handle on in terms of healthcare budgets, in terms of people having viable livelihoods. Diabetes has been increasing more in LMICs, means low and middle income countries, than in the high income countries. So again, this is happening in parts of the world that are developing, including in that lower and middle income definition are India and China. And because of their populations, they are big players in these numbers. But the rate of increase in diabetes there, as well as in other parts of the world, is very high. Over 80% of the deaths from cardiovascular disease now are in lower and middle income countries. On top of this, we have all of the issues affecting the environment and climate change. So we're not in a position where we can ensure that productivity will increase because of the changing environment. One of the areas that has not been mentioned at this conference, people have talked a bit about the impact of climate change on crop yields. Nobody's mentioned some relatively new work that's being done that shows that the composition of plant tissues is changed if it's grown in a high carbon dioxide environment. What will happen as CO2 levels increase, and it's not clear exactly what those thresholds are at this point, but the amount of zinc, iron, and protein, 3 of the most limiting nutrients in the global diet, are likely to decrease in plants grown in high CO2 environments. So we've got a bunch of things on our plate that we really need to pay attention to. We have demographic changes. We all know that the population is going to increase. Half of that increase will be in Africa. In one of the symposium presentations, Ken Giller mentioned the population issues. Everybody was talking at a global level. I think we really need to drill down and see where the places that are going to have the most significant populations increases are going to be. Half of the projected population increase is going to be in just 9 of the 195 countries in the world. India, Nigeria, Pakistan, all the countries listed on this slide. That obviously those countries are going to have to produce a lot more food, particularly because India will become the most populous country on the planet in 7 years, and by 2050, Nigeria will be number 3. There's another group of countries that I find very worrisome. These are countries that are projected to have a 5-fold increase in population, and several of them are countries that already have food security issues. Burundi, DRC, Malawi, Somalia, Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia. Some are doing better than others, but they have to improve their food production by a large amount in a very short period of time. Again, urbanization is going to have a huge impact. Gone are the sort of subsistence farmers that we used to focus on meeting the needs of their own family. If the urban population is 2/3 of the total population, one farm family will have to, in effect, feed 2 urban families. That's a simplistic analysis, but again, food productivity is going to have to increase. This is a picture from Cape Town a few years ago. No, those are not Legos, those are Coca-Cola crates. And you can see by the picture, the size of the man in the picture, how many Coca-Cola crates there were in Cape Town that day. The school sign is from Kenya. Why is it that Coca-Cola can get its message into our schools and we can't get some of the other more useful messages about nutrition into the schools? So Coca-Cola is fizzy water, food coloring, and the sugar. And it outcompetes fruit and vegetables regularly. I think we also need to study what they do because they are in many ways the opposition. Another area that is evolving now is the whole area of understanding how people decide what they're going to eat. There's a person at Cornell who does a lot of work in this area. He's looked a lot at how people regulate how much they eat and had a sort of never empty soup bowl. What he did was to have a pot of soup that was concealed so that the person eating didn't understand that it was there. And every time they took a spoonful of soup, a corresponding equal volume would reappear in the bowl so that the soup bowl never emptied. The result was the people with these never emptying soup bowls ate 73% more soup than the people with a normal bowl. Our ability to regulate what we eat, probably because we evolved in times of scarcity, is actually very poor. And changing this behavior is going to be very important as we tackle obesity. We like unhealthy foods, we love sugar, we love fat, and again, we're not so good at regulating what we consume. So this is an area that as we look at the food system and how people make these food choices, we're going to have to understand far better. Soda, absolutely implicated in obesity because of the amount of sugar, the type of sugar, and actually whether or not the sugar is in liquid form or in solid form, as it would be, for example, in an orange or other fruit. Since the year 2000, soda sales have doubled in Latin America, so that Latin America now consumes more soda than North America. 21% of the total calories consumed in Mexico are in the form of soda. They have recently implemented a sugar tax, and those figures are going down a little bit, but it's still way too much soda. The US also has had some very active campaigns, and we've gone from about 205 liters per year to 152 liters per year. That's actually a nice decrease, but that's still way too much soda. So we need to look at some of the real junk foods, and I'm putting Coca-Cola and other sugary beverages in that category. If you go to a US supermarket, 3/4 of the foods sold have added sugar. The people who make dog food even add sugar to the dog food, although a dog's digestive tract is not designed for a high sugar diet. And the average American eats about 375 kilocalories per day, and we're counting anybody over the age of 2 in this, in the form of sugar. And again, that point about the form of sugar, in the late 70s, 2/3 of the sugar that was consumed was from food. Now 2/3 of that sugar is from beverages. And as I indicated, there's a lot of indication that that is more likely to cause obesity. There's a lot of talk about the nutrition transition. People eat less coarse grains, less roots, tubers, legumes, vegetables, more refined carbohydrates, more oil, more animal source foods. We also have changed how we eat. We eat more often, we eat snacks, we eat away from home where we have far less control over what we consume, and we eat a lot more packaged food. This has implications for our waistlines as well. Here are the changes in the South African diet since Mandela took over. Soft drink consumption is up 70%. Eggs up 56%, meat up 45%, vegetable oil. If we look at the low end of that, fewer vegetables are consumed, fewer pulses, and cereal consumption's about steady. This is typical of countries undergoing the nutrition transition. One of the things that we don't think about when we look at a list like that is why. Well, in 1970, or in the 1970s, the techniques to extract oil from oil seeds were improved. That meant that oil suddenly became far, far less expensive, and people started increasing their consumption. Likewise, in the 1980s, the technology to develop high fructose corn syrup became commercially available, and sugar consumption went up significantly. So we need to look at that. The consumption between 1985 and 2010 in oils increased 3 to 6-fold. That's a big increase of a very high calorie food. So we need to bear these things in mind as we look at that transition and figure out how we make sure that people are opting into the foods that are going to maintain their health. Urbanization, as I mentioned, the farmers now have more demands on their productivity, and as urbanization takes over, there will be large changes in how and where food is processed and distributed. Some of these may be beneficial. Some of the processing methods will improve food safety. At the same time, some of the processing methods will decrease the nutritive value of those foods. We're going to need a better transportation system, particularly if we're going to have an agriculture that's dominated by small or medium-sized farms. People in urban areas eat more processed foods, more animal-sourced foods. They want foods that are cooked quickly. Between 20 and 25% of the food purchased in Eastern and Southern Africa is what is termed non-perishable. Those are things like the cupcakes that have a 2-year shelf life. They also, we're going to need to figure out cold chains or alternate processing for reasons of food safety and avoiding food waste. The players will change. Large companies and corporations and supermarkets become dominant. The foods that people grow on farms change in response to this. So sugar, soy, and corn or maize production may increase at the expense of fruits and vegetables and local products that have contributed to dietary diversity. And obviously, there will be losers in this, and I think many in this room are very worried about what is the fate of the smallholder farmers and how can we set up a system that includes them. Dietary diversity also is important. And dietary diversity doesn't mean Coca-Cola candy bars and potato crisps. We've got to make sure that people get fruit and vegetables and other, some animal source foods to ensure their health. Marketing, again, we get into that area of food behavior. It is extremely important that people learn what they need and what they don't, or they're going to be barraged with advertisements saying eat essentially junk food. All of these are pushing us in the direction of that nutrition transition. I'm going to shift gears a little bit now, and we're going to look at what happens when fruit and vegetable intake is low. The reason I focus on fruit and vegetables is they contain badly needed micronutrients, so they benefit the undernourished. They're not calorie dense, so that there are good ways to provide weight control for the overnourished. And they basically are as close to a nutritional silver bullet as you can get because they ought to be in everybody's diet. Low fruit and vegetable intake can lead to heart disease, cancer, stroke, all sorts of non-communicable diseases. It's very important that we increase fruit and vegetable intake. Here are the results of a study that was looking at whether national populations were eating the 400 grams of fruit and vegetables recommended by WHO. And the way this graph is presented is a little bit counterintuitive. The Ghanaians are 38% of the Ghanaians were eating less than 400 grams a day. In other words, 62% were meeting their requirement. The Ghanaians were the winners. They had the highest fruit and vegetable consumption. If you look at the results for South Africa, only about a third, slightly over that, were meeting their requirement. If you look at China, and this surprised me because I think of the Chinese diet as having a lot of fruit and vegetables, a very small percentage was eating the full 400 grams a day. So we're not meeting our recommended amount of fruit and vegetables. On a global level, about a quarter of the world's population is doing that. So we have to figure out what are we going to do to increase consumption of fruit and vegetables. Again, parts of the population are more likely to have low fruit and vegetable intake, the elderly and the poor. Affordability is an extremely important consideration here, and we need to figure that out. If we look at the current fruit and vegetable supply, we have currently about 3/4 of what would be needed if everybody had access to the fruit and vegetables that they need. Not surprisingly, this varies by income. The number falls to 42% for low income, a little bit higher for low and middle income. The numbers in the far right-hand column reflect what they think is going to happen in 2050. The overall supply increases, but the income distribution numbers look much worse. The low-income countries will only have 30% of what they needed. So we've got a massive problem on our hands to improve that supply and get it distributed to all of the people. Again, climate change comes into play. The amount of fruit and vegetable consumption will decrease because of the loss in yields. So what are the challenges? Well, an inadequate fruit and vegetable supply. There are many processing issues, and we've sort of skirted the edges of processing in this conference, but we're going to have to look a lot harder at what we can do to process vegetables or keep them fresh for longer. In the US and Canada, 52% of the fruit and vegetables produced are wasted. Affordability. Why do we subsidize maize? The US even has sugar subsidies, but we don't subsidize broccoli. It's crazy. We need to look at cooking methods, which can reduce nutritive value, and we need to encourage, particularly children, that they want to eat their vegetables. There was a reason when I was a child that Popeye was on the television telling us to eat our spinach. It's essential that we succeed in this, otherwise obesity, diabetes, and chronic heart disease are going to skyrocket. So what we need to do is a really creative approach to this. We can't just deal with an old box. We've got to deal with the dodecahedron. I think Julian made a very nice point about the complexity, and we're going to have to do that in order to get the food system that is not going to result in diet disaster. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Professor Pearl has just given a very striking overview of our food system and how skewed it is towards what we probably would term as bad choices that we make as human beings. I will not try to hold you from having sugar in your coffee or tea during the break. But I think it is for this reason that we should have advocates that would really influence policy and also influence human behavior towards the correct food choices. and perhaps that lies in education, but also marketing. I would really love to market broccoli. So with that, I give an opportunity for the audience to interact with the panel, either through comments or through questions, after which we will break for refreshments, and afterwards we will continue with our parallel sessions. So those of us who would like to make a comment or pose a question are very welcome to stand next to the microphone and pose their question. Ma'am.
Thank you, speakers. My name is Nazia. I'm a dietitian and PhD student at the University of Pretoria. I have a question about the best first food, which is breastfeeding and breast milk. Why do we not see a more prominent inclusion on breastfeeding in these food systems discussions? Should we not be including breastfeeding? Why do we not include it?
First of all, your point about breastfeeding is 100% correct. All of the data show that what happens to a child in the first 1,000 days is critical to their lifelong health and productivity. I didn't do it because I was not going sort of nutrient by nutrient for different stages. I should have mentioned it because it is critical, and the recommendations are very clear that exclusive breastfeeding needs to happen in the first year of life, so it should be emphasized.
Yeah, not targeted at you, but Julian as well.
But
sure, I think there are two things that we can think about. The one I put up, so one of the reasons why breastfeeding doesn't get the attention that it deserves is patriarchy. Can women breastfeed in public? In many societies, it's not considered appropriate. Are facilities provided for women to breastfeed? Is there a facility in this building for women to breastfeed? So I think that's the one thing. And then the second thing to think about, remember I talked about the price signals? So are there products available which are sending an inappropriate price signal that might persuade women not to breastfeed and rather to do something else, rather to use another type of food?
All right. Thank you for that. I will allow one more question or statement. You were first, ma'am. Oh, that mic seems not to be working.
I want to thank both of you for such interesting presentation and make one question for each, actually. For Julian, I would like to complicate a bit more the reasoning to introduce common goods. So seeds are considered common goods in some places, local seeds, and land in some contexts is also a common good. So what about linking public good and common good within your dissertation? And for Alice, I wanted to introduce, when you were putting the driving forces processing, not the technologies, but probably you were missing, although you mentioned later, the policies like subsidies and international trade, like 3 corporations in the world are controlling sugar trade and all this kind of stuff. So
I will be very quick. My name is Siriak from the University of the Western Cape. My question goes to Professor Julian May. How do we reconcile the notion of food security as a public good and food production and the distribution as private? I'm asking that question in the context, in African context, following the decade ago after the food crisis with the tsunami of investment in African agriculture, which produced food which ended up feeding people outside the continent. Thank you.
Okay. Julia.
So the common good, I think, is a very interesting and important statement because certainly in many parts of Africa, land is, as an example, of a common good. You also might recall that I talked about institutions and the kind of institutions that exist in this, and the informal institutions. So to the extent that informal institutions that allocate land, that regulate the use of that land, and if necessary, deny access to land if it's abused, those are then are very important. And I think one of the things we have to think about then is, in the context will vary from country to country, but at least in the African continent, the role then of traditional authorities who make those kinds of decisions. Someone made earlier a comment about the need to build soft skills. Those decision makers are very important and influential, and building the soft skills of traditional leadership then would be important if we are to properly manage common property. The question from Cyrek, I always like when your own students ask you really difficult questions. But embedded in that is this notion of dealing with a good which has the properties of both, and then how would we manage that? Now, again, in the context of Africa, the notion of food itself is, I think, a little more nuanced than it is, say, in the USA, where, at least in rural communities, neighbors have, in a sense, an obligation to share their food. There is a public good element. I would urge you, those of you who have been given the volume of poetry, to look at a poem that is called Porridge. And in that poem, the poet writes about the fact that as a child, she felt angry with the child from next door who used to come and share her porridge in the morning. And only as an adult did she realize with shame that that child was a child without food. So that's an example of that informal institution that at least allows some measure of protection for children in Africa, in rural Africa. Now, is that going to endure as we move into urban areas? And what then are the consequences in urban areas for the children who do not have enough food, who may not be able to go to their neighbor or to their kin who does have food that day? So I think it's, as I said, a good and difficult question to answer.
Thank you very much to the panel, and also for the contribution from the floor as well in the audience. I will not be in the way of your refreshment break, so I would like us to give one more round of applause to the speakers before we go. Okay, thank you very much.